The morning sun had barely peeked through the clouds when Robert Chen stepped out of his apartment building, adjusting his tie as he walked towards the bus stop. At 32, he had finally secured his dream position as a senior financial analyst at one of the city's most prestigious firms. The achievement felt even sweeter considering his humble beginnings as the son of immigrant parents who had worked tirelessly at their small convenience store to give him an education. That morning was different from his usual rush to work. As he approached the bus stop, he noticed an elderly woman in a wheelchair struggling to navigate the uneven sidewalk. Her wheel had gotten stuck in a crack, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't free herself. Several people walked past, their eyes glued to their phones or deliberately looking away. Robert checked his watch. He had exactly 20 minutes until his important client meeting. His mind raced with calculations: 5 minutes to help the woman, 10 minutes on the bus, 5 minutes to walk to the office. It would be cutting it close, but he couldn't bring himself to walk away. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, approaching her with a gentle smile. "Would you like some help?" The woman looked up, relief washing over her weathered face. "Oh, thank you, dear. I've been stuck here for what feels like forever." Her name was Mrs. Thompson, she explained, and she was trying to reach the medical center 3 blocks away for her weekly checkup. Robert didn't hesitate. Not only did he help free her wheelchair, but he also offered to push her to the medical center. As they moved along the sidewalk, Mrs. Thompson shared stories about her life as a former school teacher and her struggles since losing mobility after a stroke 2 years ago. Her children lived in different states, and she had been learning to navigate life independently, though some days were harder than others. The walk took longer than expected. The sidewalks were uneven, and they had to carefully maneuver around various obstacles. Robert's phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, messages from his colleague about the client meeting. But something in Mrs. Thompson's stories and grateful smile made it impossible for him to rush or leave her halfway. By the time they reached the medical center, Robert was 45 minutes late for his meeting. He helped Mrs. Thompson check in at the reception and made sure she was comfortable before rushing out. She caught his hand before he left, her eyes brimming with tears. "You know," she said, "people like you restore my faith in humanity. Thank you for not walking past like everyone else." Those words would echo in his mind throughout the day that followed. When he finally reached his office, he found his supervisor, Mr. Harrison, waiting at his desk with a stern expression. The client had left after waiting for 30 minutes, taking with them a potential multi-million-dollar contract that the firm had been pursuing for months. "Where were you?" Mr. Harrison demanded, his face red with anger. The office had fallen silent, other employees pretending to work while stealing glances at the confrontation. Robert explained the situation honestly, describing how he had helped Mrs. Thompson. He expected some understanding, perhaps a reprimand about not calling ahead. Instead, Mr. Harrison's expression hardened. "You're telling me you jeopardized $1 million deal to help some random old lady?" The words cut through the office silence like a knife. "This isn't a charity organization, Chen. We're here to make money, and your bleeding heart just cost us big time." The next hour passed in a blur of harsh words and accusations. By lunchtime, Robert found himself sitting in HR, being handed a termination letter. The official reason cited was failure to meet professional obligations, but everyone knew the real story. He had chosen compassion over corporate interests, and in the cutthroat world of finance, that was an unforgivable sin. As he packed up his desk, Robert's colleagues avoided eye contact. A few sent sympathetic glances his way, but no one dared to speak up. His mind raced with worries about his mortgage, his parents' medical bills that he helped with, and the career he had spent years building. Yet, strangely, when he thought about Mrs. Thompson's grateful smile and her words about faith in humanity, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Walking out of the building that afternoon, carrying a box with his personal belongings, Robert felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Fear about the future, certainly. anger at the injustice of it all. But also a peculiar sense of peace. He had followed his conscience, just as his parents had taught him, even though it had cost him dearly. That evening, as he sat in his apartment updating his resume, his phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end belonged to a local news reporter. Apparently, Mrs. Thompson's granddaughter had been in the medical center that morning and had witnessed Robert's kindness. She had shared the story on social media, and it had started gaining attention. "Would you be willing to share your side of the story?" the reporter asked. "People are particularly moved by the fact that you lost your job over this." Robert hesitated. He hadn't helped Mrs. Thompson for attention or praise. But as he considered the reporter's request, he realized that perhaps sharing his story could inspire others to choose kindness, even when it came at a personal cost. Maybe that was worth more than any corporate success. Little did Robert know, as he agreed to the interview, that his act of compassion was about to set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life but impact his entire community in ways he could never have imagined. His story was about to become a powerful reminder that sometimes, the biggest victories come disguised as losses, and the true measure of success isn't always found in a paycheck. As he ended the call with the reporter, Robert looked out his window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he was at peace with his choice. After all, he had learned from his parents that character was built not in moments of convenience, but in moments of difficult choices. This was just the beginning of his story, and somewhere deep inside, he knew that the best chapters were yet to come. The following morning, Robert woke up to his phone buzzing incessantly. The local news segment about his story had aired late last night, and social media had turned it into something much bigger than he had anticipated. His inbox was flooded with messages from strangers, many sharing their own stories of choosing kindness over career advancement, others expressing outrage at his former company's decision. Among the messages was an email from Mrs. Thompson's granddaughter, Ashley. She worked as a social media manager and had shared his story on various platforms. The post had gone viral overnight, with thousands of shares and comments. People were using the hashtag #ChooseKindness, sharing their own experiences of random acts of kindness and their consequences. As Robert sipped his morning coffee, trying to process this unexpected turn of events, he received another surprising call. It was from a small investment firm on the other side of town. The owner, Mrs. Kumar, had seen his story and was interested in meeting him. "We need more people like you in the financial industry," she said. "Someone who understands that business isn't just about numbers, it's about people." But before Robert could fully process this potential opportunity, his story took another unexpected turn. Former clients from his previous firm began reaching out. Many were disappointed with how the company had handled the situation, and some were even considering taking their business elsewhere. The incident had sparked a larger conversation about corporate culture and human values in the business world. That afternoon, Robert visited his parents at their convenience store. The small bell chimed as he pushed open the familiar door, the smell of his mother's homemade dumplings wafting from the back room where she often cooked for regular customers. His father was restocking shelves, just as he had done every day for the past 30 years. "Ba, Ma," Robert called out, helping his father with a heavy box of supplies. "I need to tell you something." He had been dreading this conversation, knowing how hard his parents had worked to help him get his education and corporate job. But before he could continue, his mother emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. "We already know," she said, holding up her phone where his story was playing on a news website. "We're proud of you, son." His father nodded in agreement. "You know, when we first came to this country, we had nothing. But people helped us, strangers who didn't know us. That's why we've always tried to help others at our store, even when we couldn't afford to." He gestured to the wall behind the counter, where Robert noticed for the first time a collection of thank you notes from customers who had been given food during hard times. While they were talking, the store's door chimed again. A group of local residents walked in, many of whom Robert recognized as regular customers from his childhood. They had seen his story and wanted to show their support. One elderly gentleman spoke up, "Your parents have been helping this community for years. Now we know where you got your heart from." The next few hours turned into an impromptu gathering at the store. People shared stories about times when Robert's parents had helped them, extending credit during tough months, providing free meals, or simply offering a kind word when needed. Robert realized that his act of kindness wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a legacy his parents had built in their own quiet way. Later that evening, as Robert was helping close up the store, he received another call. This time it was from a prominent business magazine wanting to feature him in an article about ethical leadership and corporate social responsibility. The reporter explained that his story had resonated with many young professionals who felt torn between career advancement and their personal values. "Your story is making people question the culture of putting profits over people," the reporter explained. "It's starting conversations in boardrooms across the city." As Robert walked home that night, he passed the bus stop where he had met Mrs. Thompson. The spot looked different now, somehow more significant. He thought about how a single moment of choice could ripple out into the world in unexpected ways. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Kumar, confirming their meeting for tomorrow morning. She had mentioned something about starting a new division focused on ethical investment and community development. The possibility of building a career that aligned with his values began to feel more real. But what touched Robert most was a handwritten letter he received that evening from Mrs. Thompson. She wrote about how his kindness had given her hope during a particularly difficult time in her life. She mentioned that she had been feeling increasingly isolated and invisible in a fast-paced world that seemed to have no time for people like her. His simple act of stopping to help had reminded her that she mattered. As Robert prepared for bed that night, he thought about how losing his job had actually freed him to discover what truly mattered in his life and career. His parents' example of quiet, consistent kindness had shaped him more than any corporate success could have. The story wasn't just about one act of kindness anymore, it had become about challenging the way we measure success and value in our society. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities and challenges, but Robert felt ready to face them. His father's words echoed in his mind, "In business and in life, people remember how you make them feel." Perhaps that was the most valuable lesson of all, one that no amount of money could buy. The morning of Robert's meeting with Mrs. Kumar dawned bright and clear. He stood before his mirror, adjusting his tie, the same one he had worn on that fateful day. This time, though, his reflection showed something different, confidence that came from knowing he had made the right choice, regardless of the consequences. The small investment firm's office was nothing like his previous workplace. Instead of cold, steel and glass minimalism, warm colors and plants filled the space. In the reception area, a wall displayed photos of local community projects the firm had supported. As Robert waited, he noticed something surprising, a familiar face in one of the pictures. It was Mrs. Thompson, standing beside Mrs. Kumar at what appeared to be a community center opening ceremony. Mrs. Kumar's office reflected her different approach to business. Instead of the typical awards and certificates, her walls featured thank you letters from community members and photos of families who had benefited from the firm's ethical investment strategies. She greeted Robert with a warm smile and offered him tea in a handmade cup from her hometown. "You know, Robert," she began, "when I started this firm 15 years ago, people said I was crazy. They said mixing business with social responsibility would never work." She gestured to a framed newspaper article about her journey from immigrant to successful business owner. "But I believed that profit and purpose could coexist. Your story reminded me why I started this journey." As they talked, Mrs. Kumar shared her vision for a new division focused on community development and ethical investing. She wanted to create financial products that would help small businesses like Robert's parents' store thrive while supporting community initiatives. The position she offered wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to reshape how business could serve society. Meanwhile, across town, the ripples of Robert's story continued to spread. His former workplace was facing unprecedented scrutiny. Several major clients had publicly announced their intention to review their relationships with the firm, citing concerns about corporate culture and values. The company's stock price had taken a hit, and the board of directors called an emergency meeting to address the situation. That afternoon, Robert received an unexpected visitor at his parents' store. It was his former colleague, David, who had always been quiet during office confrontations. "I couldn't sleep after what happened," David admitted, helping Robert stock shelves as they talked. "I've been wanting to speak up about similar issues for years, but I was too afraid. Your story gave me the courage to finally do something." David shared how he had started a workplace ethics group at the firm, supported by other employees who had been silently struggling with similar moral dilemmas. The group was pushing for policy changes and a more humane approach to business. "We're using your experience as a case study," he said with a small smile. "You might have lost your job, but you've sparked a movement." Later that day, Robert visited the community center where Mrs. Thompson volunteered. The place was buzzing with activity, seniors teaching young children traditional crafts, teenagers helping elderly residents with technology, and people of all ages sharing meals and stories. Mrs. Thompson sat in her usual spot by the window, teaching a young girl how to knit. "Robert," she called out, her face lighting up. "I was hoping you'd come by." She introduced him to the center's director, who shared how their programs had been struggling due to lack of funding. Many of their elderly members felt isolated, and the center provided their only connection to the community. Robert's mind began racing with ideas about how Mrs. Kumar's new community investment division could help places like this. As he sat with Mrs. Thompson, watching the intergenerational activities around them, she shared something surprising. "You know, dear, the day you helped me, I was actually on my way to my last medical appointment. I had decided to give up on my therapy sessions because getting there had become too difficult." Her eyes welled up with tears. "But your kindness that day, it reminded me that I shouldn't give up. Now I'm not only continuing my therapy, but I'm also helping others here at the center." The center's director mentioned that several local businesses had reached out after Robert's story went viral, offering transportation assistance for elderly members and various other support services. What had started as a simple act of kindness was transforming into a community-wide movement of mutual support and care. That evening, Robert received an email from a young business student who had seen his story. The student wrote about how Robert's experience had inspired him to change his career focus from corporate finance to social enterprise. Attached was a class presentation he had given, using Robert's story to illustrate the importance of ethical decision-making in business. As Robert walked home that night, he passed by his old office building. The lights were still on in the conference rooms, where he could see groups of people in intense discussion, probably another emergency meeting about the PR crisis. But instead of feeling bitter, he felt hopeful. Sometimes it takes a shock to the system to catalyze change. His phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Kumar, confirming his acceptance of the position and outlining their first project, creating a financial literacy program for the community center. The salary was lower than his previous job, but the opportunity to make a real difference made it feel far more valuable. Robert stopped at the bus stop where it all began, sitting for a moment in the growing dusk. An elderly man struggled with his shopping bags nearby, and without hesitation, several young people rushed to help him. The man mentioned how he had seen Robert's story on the news, and how it had restored his faith in the younger generation. As the city lights began to twinkle on, Robert realized that sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted helps you find everything you actually needed. His story wasn't just about one act of kindness anymore, it had become a catalyst for community transformation, proving that the currency of compassion could be more powerful than any dollar amount. 1 month into his new role at Mrs. Kumar's firm, Robert found himself in a very different kind of morning meeting. Instead of discussing profit margins and market forecasts, he sat at a large round table with community leaders, small business owners, and social workers, all working together to design financial programs that could make a real difference in people's lives. The community center had become their pilot project. With Robert's guidance, they were developing a microlending program for local small businesses, particularly those run by elderly entrepreneurs or those supporting senior citizens. Mrs. Thompson, who had become something of a local celebrity herself, served as an advisor, offering insights into the challenges faced by older community members. That morning, as Robert presented their progress to the board, an unexpected visitor arrived. It was Mr. Harrison, his former supervisor, looking considerably less confident than he had on the day he fired Robert. The room fell silent as he asked to speak with Robert privately. In Mrs. Kumar's peaceful garden courtyard, Mr. Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Our firm has lost 30% of its client base since your story went public," he admitted. "But that's not why I'm here." He explained how his own elderly father had recently suffered a stroke, and no one had stopped to help him when he fell at a bus stop. "It made me realize, we've created a world where people are afraid to help each other. I've been part of the problem." Robert listened quietly, noting how different this man seemed from the angry boss who had fired him. Mr. Harrison continued, revealing that he had been attending board meetings to propose a complete overhaul of the company's corporate culture. "We want to create a foundation focused on community service," he said. "And, we'd like your help designing it." The irony wasn't lost on Robert, but he saw an opportunity for something bigger than personal vindication. "Let me discuss it with my team," he replied, already seeing possibilities for collaboration between the two firms that could benefit the community even more. Back at his parents' store that afternoon, Robert shared the news with his father while helping to organize a new community bulletin board they'd installed. His father chuckled, sharing a piece of wisdom from his own experience. "Sometimes, son, the universe has a way of turning our biggest setbacks into setups for something better." The store had evolved too. Instead of just selling groceries, it had become a hub for community connection. Robert's parents had started a "pay it forward" wall where customers could prepay for items that others might need. The idea had caught on, and other local businesses were adopting similar practices. That evening, Robert visited the medical center where he had first helped Mrs. Thompson. The facility had undergone changes too, inspired by the viral story. They had implemented a volunteer program where people could sign up to accompany elderly patients to their appointments. The waiting room now featured a kindness corner with stories of community members helping each other. As he walked through the halls, a young nurse stopped him. "You probably don't remember," she said, "but I was here the day you helped Mrs. Thompson. I was running late and rushed past both of you." She paused, emotion filling her voice. "I felt so ashamed afterward. Now I volunteer with the accompaniment program during my off hours. Your story made me realize we always have time to be kind, we just have to choose it." Later that night, Robert received an email that made his heart skip a beat. A major national news network wanted to do a feature story about how his act of kindness had sparked a community transformation. They were particularly interested in the collaboration between his new firm and his former workplace, a story of redemption and positive change. But what touched Robert most was a video compilation Mrs. Thompson's granddaughter had created. It showed dozens of security camera clips from around the city, people helping strangers at bus stops, in stores, on streets. Each clip was dated after his story had gone viral. The hashtag #ChooseKindness had evolved into a real movement, with people consciously choosing to stop and help others, even when it wasn't convenient. At the community center's weekly dinner, Robert sat with a diverse group of residents, listening to their stories. An elderly man shared how a young woman had helped him learn to use video chat to connect with his grandchildren. A teenage volunteer talked about how spending time with seniors had given her a new perspective on life. Mrs. Thompson beamed proudly as she showed everyone the sweater she had knitted for Robert, a thank you gift that meant more than any designer suit he'd ever owned. The center's director pulled Robert aside to share some exciting news. Inspired by their success, centers in other cities were reaching out to learn about their programs. The model of combining financial support with social connection was proving powerful, and Mrs. Kumar's firm was being consulted about expanding their approach nationally. As Robert drove home that evening, he passed his old office building. The company's logo had been redesigned to include the words, "Community First," a small but significant change that reflected bigger transformations within. He smiled, remembering how differently things had looked just a month ago. At a red light, he noticed a young professional helping an elderly man with a walker cross the street. The young man was wearing a suit and clearly rushing somewhere, but he had stopped anyway. Their eyes met briefly, and they shared a knowing smile, the kind that acknowledged they were part of something bigger than themselves. Back home, Robert sat down to write in his journal, a habit he'd started to document this unexpected journey. As he reflected on the day's events, he realized that losing his job hadn't been an ending at all. It had been the beginning of a new way of seeing success, value, and community. His simple choice to help Mrs. Thompson hadn't just changed his life, it had created a ripple effect that was still expanding, touching lives in ways he never could have imagined. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Kumar about tomorrow's meeting with potential investors interested in their community development model. But this time, instead of feeling pressure about impressing them with numbers and projections, he felt excited about sharing stories of real impact and human connection. After all, he had learned that the most valuable investments weren't always about money, sometimes they were about taking the time to help a stranger, even when it costs you everything you thought you needed. As autumn leaves began to color the city streets, Robert found himself standing before a packed auditorium at the National Business Ethics Conference. 6 months had passed since that life-changing morning at the bus stop, and he could hardly believe where his journey had led him. The conference organizers had invited him to deliver the keynote speech about the transformation that had swept through his community. As he looked out at the sea of faces, he spotted Mrs. Kumar and Mrs. Thompson in the front row, both beaming with pride. Even his parents had closed their store early to attend, something they'd never done before. 6 months ago, Robert began, his voice steady and clear, I lost my job for being late to a meeting. But what I gained that day was worth more than any corporate success. He shared not just his story, but the countless others that had emerged in its wake, stories of everyday heroes who had chosen kindness over convenience, compassion over competition. In the audience, business leaders from across the country listened intently. Some took notes, others nodded in recognition of their own struggles with balancing profit and purpose. Robert could see his former boss, Mr. Harrison, sitting with a group of executives, all wearing #ChooseKindness pins on their lapels. After the speech, during the networking session, Robert was approached by countless individuals sharing their own experiences. A CEO from a major tech company revealed how she had implemented a kindness leave policy, allowing employees paid time off for community service. A startup founder described how he had redesigned his entire business model after hearing Robert's story, prioritizing social impact alongside financial growth. But the most touching moment came when an elderly gentleman approached him with tears in his eyes. He introduced himself as a retired bus driver who had spent 30 years watching people rush past those who needed help. Your story, he said, his voice trembling, it's changing the way people behave at bus stops across the city. I still visit my old route sometimes, and I see people helping each other every day now. That evening, at a small celebration dinner in his parents' store, Robert sat surrounded by the unlikely family his journey had created. Mrs. Thompson was teaching Mrs. Kumar how to knit, while his mother shared recipes with some of the community center regulars. His father and Mr. Harrison were deep in conversation about implementing the pay-it-forward system in other businesses. The store itself had become a model for social enterprise. Regular customers now voluntarily paid extra on their purchases to support the community fund, which helped those in need. The bulletin board was covered with photos and thank you notes from people whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of kindness. As they shared meals and stories, a news alert popped up on everyone's phones simultaneously. A major investment firm had just announced the creation of a billion-dollar fund focused on supporting businesses with strong social responsibility practices. The announcement cited Robert's story as their inspiration, quoting his famous words, "Success isn't measured by what we gain, but by what we give." Later that night, Mrs. Thompson pulled Robert aside to share something special. She had received letters from elderly people across the country who had seen her part in the story. Many expressed how they had felt invisible in society until now. "You didn't just help me that day," she said, squeezing his hand. "You helped create a movement that's helping people find their voice and their value again." The community center had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a simple gathering place had evolved into a comprehensive support network. They now offered job training programs where seniors taught traditional skills to young people, while younger members provided technology lessons in return. The center had become a model for intergenerational connection, with similar programs sprouting up in cities nationwide. Robert's work with Mrs. Kumar's firm had expanded too. They had created a revolutionary financial product that allowed investors to directly support community initiatives while earning reasonable returns. The waiting list of investors grew daily, proving that profit and purpose could indeed go hand in hand. As Robert helped clean up after the dinner, his father shared a surprising piece of news. The convenience store's success had caught the attention of a national retail association. They wanted to feature the store's community-centered business model in their next campaign, highlighting how small businesses could thrive while serving their communities. Just then, David, Robert's former colleague, rushed in with exciting news. The workplace ethics group he had started had grown into a national network of corporate employees advocating for more humane business practices. They were organizing the first national conference on corporate kindness, and they wanted Robert to help shape the agenda. Outside the store, a small crowd had gathered around an elderly woman who had tripped on the sidewalk. Without hesitation, several people rushed to help her up, offer water, and ensure she was okay. One young professional even called a ride-share service to take her home safely. This scene, once rare, had become wonderfully common throughout the city. As Robert walked home that night, he passed the bus stop where everything had changed. Someone had placed a small plaque there that read, "Kindness begins here." Below it was a QR code that linked to a website where people could share their own stories of giving and receiving help. His phone buzzed with a message from a documentary filmmaker interested in capturing how a single act of kindness had sparked a social movement. The filmmaker had traced similar stories of transformation in communities across the country, all inspired by what had happened here. Reaching his apartment, Robert found a package waiting at his door. Inside was a book, an advance copy of Mrs. Thompson's autobiography, Never Too Late to Make a Difference. She had dedicated it to him, writing, "To the young man who showed me that every moment is an opportunity to change the world, one kind act at a time." As he settled in for the night, Robert reflected on how losing his job had led to finding his true calling. He wasn't just helping people with their finances anymore, he was helping change the way society viewed success, community, and human connection. The currency of kindness, it turned out, had a way of multiplying in value far beyond any traditional investment. Winter had settled over the city, bringing with it a blanket of snow and, surprisingly, a warmth of human connection that seemed to defy the cold. 8 months after Robert's fateful decision, he found himself walking through the halls of City Hall, where local government officials had called a special meeting to discuss what they were now calling the Kindness Initiative. The council chambers were packed with familiar faces: Mrs. Thompson, now heading a senior citizens advisory board, Mrs. Kumar, whose ethical investment firm had grown to open branches in 3 other cities, and dozens of community members whose lives had been touched by the movement that had started with a simple act of help at a bus stop. The mayor, inspired by the transformation she had witnessed in her city, was proposing a revolutionary policy package. It included tax incentives for businesses that implemented community service programs, funding for accessibility improvements at public transit stops, and the creation of kindness zones, designated areas where trained volunteers would be available to assist those in need. What began as one man's choice, the mayor announced, gesturing toward Robert, has shown us that kindness isn't just a personal virtue, it's a powerful force for social change. Today, we're making it official policy. After the meeting, Robert stepped outside to find a scene that would have been unimaginable 8 months ago. The steps of City Hall had been transformed into an impromptu community gathering space. Local businesses had set up stands offering free hot drinks and snacks to passers-by. Students from the nearby university were helping elderly residents navigate the icy sidewalks, while business professionals in suits took time to assist parents struggling with strollers. His phone buzzed with a notification. The documentary about the movement had just won a major film festival award. The filmmaker had captured not just the big moments of change, but the small, daily acts of kindness that had become the new normal in their city. Scenes of corporate executives volunteering at soup kitchens, teenagers teaching computer skills to seniors, and strangers helping strangers had resonated with audiences worldwide. Back at the community center, Robert found a group of international visitors studying their model of social integration. Representatives from cities across the globe had come to learn how a grassroots movement had transformed an entire community's culture. Mrs. Thompson, now a sought-after speaker on social change, was sharing her perspective on how being helped had inspired her to help others. You see, she explained to the visitors, what Robert did wasn't just about helping me get to my appointment. He showed all of us, that we matter, that we're not invisible. And when people feel seen, they start seeing others too. The center itself had evolved into something extraordinary. What began as a simple gathering place now housed a state-of-the-art technology lab where young people taught digital skills to seniors, a commercial kitchen where community members shared cultural recipes and cooking techniques, and a small business incubator specifically designed to support elderly entrepreneurs. That afternoon, Robert received an unexpected call from a national policy institute. They had been studying the impact of the Kindness Initiative on various social metrics. The results were remarkable. Reported cases of depression among elderly residents had decreased significantly, small business growth had increased, and even traffic accidents had reduced as people became more mindful and considerate of others. At his parents' store, now a case study in sustainable community business practices, Robert met with a group of corporate executives who had flown in from across the country. They were part of a growing movement of business leaders committed to redefining corporate success. His father, ever humble, shared how their simple store policies had created a ripple effect throughout the business community. "We never set out to start a movement," his father said, restocking shelves as he spoke. "We just believed that taking care of our community was good business. Now, it seems the whole world is catching up to this idea." Later that evening, at a community dinner hosted in the store, Robert watched as unlikely friendships blossomed across generational and social divides. His former boss, Mr. Harrison, was there too, sharing how his company's transformation had inspired other firms to reevaluate their priorities. The angry man who had fired Robert months ago had become one of the movement's most passionate advocates. A young entrepreneur approached Robert with tears in her eyes. She had been about to close her struggling business when she heard his story. Inspired, she had restructured her company to focus on community impact alongside profit. Now, 6 months later, her business was thriving, and she had helped 5 other small businesses do the same. The night took an unexpected turn when a group of city transportation workers arrived. They had just finished installing the first kindness bench at the original bus stop where Robert had helped Mrs. Thompson. The bench, equipped with a help button and staffed by volunteers during peak hours, was designed to ensure that no one would ever have to struggle alone again. As the evening wound down, Robert received another surprising piece of news. A major university had created a scholarship in his name, specifically for students who demonstrated exceptional commitment to community service. The first recipient was a young woman who had started a program connecting lonely seniors with college students for weekly video calls. Walking home through the snowy streets, Robert noticed something that brought tears to his eyes. At every bus stop he passed, people were looking up from their phones, making eye contact, offering help without being asked. The simple act of acknowledging each other's humanity had become contagious. In his apartment, Robert found a letter from a children's book publisher. They wanted to create a series about everyday heroes, starting with his story. The goal was to teach the next generation that true success isn't measured by personal achievement, but by the positive impact we have on others' lives. As he sat down to read Mrs. Thompson's latest email, she had become quite tech-savvy thanks to the center's programs. Robert reflected on how losing his job had led to finding his true purpose. The corporate world he had once desperately wanted to succeed in now looked different. Success wasn't about climbing a ladder, it was about building bridges between people. His calendar for the next day was full: a meeting with city planners about expanding the kindness zones, a workshop at the community center on ethical business practices, and a video call with international organizations interested in implementing similar programs in their cities. But unlike his days in corporate finance, these commitments didn't feel like work, they felt like purpose. 1 year had passed since that morning at the bus stop. Spring flowers were blooming across the city as Robert stood on stage at the first annual Global Kindness Summit, looking out at delegates from over 50 countries. The movement that had started with a simple act of helping Mrs. Thompson had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. The summit was being held in the newly renovated convention center, which had been redesigned with accessibility and community connection in mind. Every corner had been transformed into a welcoming space where people could rest, connect, and help one another. The walls were adorned with photos and stories from around the world, all inspired by what had begun in their city. Mrs. Thompson, now a beloved figure in the international kindness movement, opened the summit with a speech that brought tears to many eyes. "A year ago, I was invisible," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Today, I stand before you as proof that one person's kindness can change not just a life, but the world. We're not just helping people reach their destinations anymore, we're helping humanity find its way back to its heart." During the lunch break, Robert walked through the exhibition hall where cities and organizations were showcasing their kindness initiatives. Chicago had created a network of warmth stations, local businesses that offered shelter and assistance to anyone in need during harsh weather. Tokyo had implemented a program where retired professionals mentored young people while receiving help with technology and daily tasks. Sydney had transformed its public transportation system to include dedicated helpers at every major stop. A group of business school students approached Robert, eager to share how his story had influenced their curriculum. Their university had completely redesigned its MBA program to include courses on ethical leadership and community impact. "The case study of your firing and its aftermath is now required reading," one student explained. "It's teaching us that the best business decisions aren't always about the bottom line." Back at the community center, which was now connected virtually with similar centers worldwide, Robert watched as Mrs. Kumar led a global webinar on ethical investment strategies. Her firm had developed a revolutionary rating system that measured companies not just by their profits, but by their positive impact on communities. Major investment firms were beginning to adopt similar metrics. "The financial world is finally understanding what we learned from Robert's story," Mrs. Kumar explained to her virtual audience. "True wealth isn't just about money, it's about the richness of human connection and the dividends of kindness." That afternoon, Robert visited his parents' store, which had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for social entrepreneurs. His father was mentoring a group of small business owners from across Asia, sharing how their simple pay-it-forward system had evolved into a sustainable model of community support. His mother's cooking classes, teaching traditional recipes while fostering cross-cultural connections, had become so popular they were now streamed online to audiences worldwide. A technology company had developed an app inspired by their story, Kindness Connect, which helped people easily find and offer assistance in their communities. It had already been downloaded millions of times, with users reporting countless stories of lives changed through simple acts of help. As Robert helped his father stock shelves, a familiar face appeared at the store entrance. It was the nurse from the medical center who had been inspired to start the patient accompaniment program. She had exciting news: the program had been so successful that it was being implemented in hospitals across the country. "We're seeing incredible improvements in patient outcomes," she shared. "It turns out that kindness is actually good medicine." The evening brought another surprise. Mr. Harrison, Robert's former boss, had gathered a coalition of major corporations to announce the creation of the Corporate Kindness Alliance. Member companies pledged to prioritize social responsibility and employee volunteering, with concrete metrics for measuring their community impact. The stock market had responded positively, showing that ethical business practices could drive financial success. At the community center's evening session, Robert participated in a global video conference connecting similar centers around the world. Elderly residents from Tokyo chatted with seniors in Buenos Aires, sharing stories and forming friendships across cultural and linguistic barriers. Young volunteers helped translate, while learning valuable life lessons from their elderly friends. Mrs. Thompson, who had become something of a grandmother figure to many young volunteers, was teaching an online class about the importance of intergenerational connections. "In our rush to move forward," she explained, "we sometimes forget to look around at who might need our help. But thanks to Robert's example, we're learning to slow down and see each other again." The documentary about their movement had sparked a new genre of films focusing on everyday acts of kindness and their ripple effects. Television networks were replacing some of their reality competition shows with programs highlighting community heroes and social impact initiatives. The culture was shifting, one story at a time. Late that night, as Robert walked home, he passed the original bus stop, now a historic landmark with a small museum dedicated to the kindness movement. The interactive exhibition allowed visitors to experience what it felt like to need help and to offer help, fostering empathy and understanding. His phone buzzed with messages from around the world, stories of lives changed, communities transformed, and hope restored. A group of researchers had published a study showing measurable improvements in mental health, social cohesion, and economic stability in cities that had embraced the kindness initiative. Reaching his apartment, Robert found an invitation to speak at the United Nations about the role of grassroots movements in creating sustainable social change. The world was finally recognizing that the solutions to many global challenges might lie in the simple act of people helping people. As he sat down to prepare his speech, Robert thought about how losing his job had seemed like the end of his world. Instead, it had been the beginning of a movement that was changing the world. His story had shown that sometimes the most powerful changes start not with grand plans or huge budgets, but with one person choosing kindness over convenience. The next morning's summit session would focus on expanding the movement to developing nations, ensuring that the revolution of kindness reached those who needed it most. But as Robert reviewed his notes, he smiled, knowing that the real magic wasn't in the big initiatives or global programs. It was in the millions of small moments where people chose to stop, to see, and to help. 18 months after that life-changing morning at the bus stop, Robert stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting the same tie he had worn on the day he lost his job. Today was special. The city was celebrating the official opening of the first Kindness Institute, a center dedicated to studying and promoting the impact of compassion on society. The morning sun filtered through his window as he remembered how different his life had been when his only concern was climbing the corporate ladder. Now, as he prepared to give the opening speech at the institute, he realized that losing everything had actually given him everything that truly mattered. The institute itself was a marvel of inclusive design. Located in a renovated historic building, it featured spaces for research, education, and community gathering. But what made it truly special was that it had been funded entirely through small donations from people whose lives had been touched by the kindness movement. As Robert arrived at the opening ceremony, he was greeted by familiar faces that had become like family. Mrs. Thompson, elegant in a blue dress she had knitted herself, sat in the front row. Next to her was Mrs. Kumar, whose ethical investment firm now had branches in 12 countries. His parents had closed their store for the day, the second time ever, to attend the ceremony. "You know," Mrs. Thompson whispered as Robert sat beside her before the ceremony, "I never told you what I was thinking that day at the bus stop." Her eyes misted over as she continued, "I had been feeling so lonely, so forgotten by the world, that I had decided it would be my last time going out. Your kindness didn't just help me get to an appointment, it gave me a reason to keep living." The ceremony began with a video compilation of kindness stories from around the world. There was footage of corporate executives serving meals at homeless shelters, students creating technology solutions for elderly neighbors, and countless moments of spontaneous help between strangers. Each story traced its inspiration back to what had happened at that bus stop. When Robert took the stage, he looked out at an audience that represented the full spectrum of humanity, from local residents to international delegates, from business leaders to community volunteers. Even his former company's board members were present, wearing the now familiar #ChooseKindness pins. 18 months ago, Robert began, I thought success meant having the corner office and the biggest salary. Today, I measure success by the number of lives touched, the connections made, and the moments where people choose to help each other. We've learned that kindness isn't just a nice idea, it's a powerful force for social change. The Institute's first research findings were remarkable. Cities that had implemented kindness initiatives showed significant decreases in loneliness, depression, and social isolation. Crime rates had dropped, community engagement had increased, and even economic indicators showed improvement. Kindness, it turned out, was good for everyone. During the lunch break, Robert walked through the Institute's interactive exhibits. One display showed the global reach of the movement, pins on a world map marking places where similar initiatives had taken root. Another featured a virtual reality experience that let people feel what it was like to be elderly or disabled, fostering empathy and understanding. A group of young entrepreneurs approached him, eager to share their stories. One had created a ride-sharing service specifically for elderly and disabled passengers. Another had developed a neighborhood support network that matched people's needs with volunteers' skills. Each venture combined social impact with sustainable business models. In the Institute's research wing, scientists were studying the neurological and social impacts of kindness. Their findings suggested that witnessing acts of kindness triggered a cascade of positive changes in the brain, making people more likely to help others themselves. The kindness contagion was real, and it was measurable. Later that afternoon, Robert visited the bus stop where everything had begun. It had been preserved in its original state, though a small plaque now marked its significance. As he stood there, a young woman helped an elderly man with his groceries. Neither of them knew they were standing at the birthplace of a global movement, they were simply continuing what had become natural in their community. Back at the Institute, the evening session focused on the future. Cities worldwide were implementing kindness infrastructure, designing public spaces and services with human connection in mind. Businesses were measuring their success not just in profits but in positive social impact. Schools were teaching empathy and community service alongside traditional subjects. Mrs. Thompson took the stage to share her vision for the Institute's senior advocacy program. We're not just teaching people to help seniors, she explained. We're teaching the world that every person, regardless of age or ability, has value and wisdom to share. The night concluded with a surprise announcement. The United Nations had officially recognized the third Thursday of every month as Global Kindness Day, inspired by the date when Robert had helped Mrs. Thompson. But as people in the audience pointed out, every day had become a kindness day in their community. As the celebrations wound down, Robert found himself sitting in his parents' store with his closest friends. Mrs. Thompson was teaching Mrs. Kumar a new knitting pattern. His father was sharing business wisdom with young entrepreneurs. His mother was preparing food for tomorrow's community dinner. Mr. Harrison was discussing plans for expanding the Corporate Kindness Alliance. Looking around at these people who had become his family, Robert realized that the true miracle wasn't in the global impact of their movement, it was in these small moments of connection, these tiny choices to see and help each other. His phone buzzed with a message. Someone had just posted a photo of a stranger helping another stranger at a bus stop in a small town on the other side of the world. The caption read, "I heard about what happened in your city. Today, I chose kindness too." As Robert walked home that night, he passed dozens of people helping each other in small ways, carrying groceries, offering directions, sharing umbrellas. None of them were doing it for recognition or reward. They were doing it because, somewhere along the way, kindness had become their natural response to seeing someone in need. In his apartment, Robert found a letter from a high school student who had researched his story for a class project. "You lost your job for being kind," the student wrote, "but you helped create a world where being kind is everyone's job." Looking out at the city lights, Robert smiled. The world hadn't become perfect, there were still challenges and struggles. But something fundamental had shifted. People had remembered how to see each other, how to stop for each other, how to help each other. And in that remembering, they had found something that all the corporate success in the world couldn't provide, the simple, profound joy of human connection. The tie he had worn on that fateful day hung on his closet door, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as losses. He had lost a job but found a calling. He had lost a career but gained a community. He had lost his way up the corporate ladder but found his way home to what truly mattered. And somewhere in the city, at a bus stop just like any other, another person was choosing to stop and help a stranger, continuing the endless ripple effect of that one simple choice to be kind.